Hello, I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome to Surviving Bad, where we explore Iowa's stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Today, we're talking about cannabis impaired driving. Most marijuana users and even non-users believe you can safely drive a car when using marijuana. Apparently, that is not true. In states with legal marijuana and cannabis impaired driving fatalities are tracked, we're seeing them overtaking alcohol impaired fatalities. Now, joining us to help us understand the problem is Dr. Tim Brown from the National Advanced Driving Simulator at the University of Iowa. Tim, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about why you're here and what you do.
Sounds good. Thank you, Peter. So my name is Tim Brown, and I'm a researcher at the University of Iowa. I've been here, it seems like forever. Came as an undergrad and enjoyed my time here so much. I got a PhD and then stayed to do research at the driving simulator. And so I've been here doing research since 2020, early 2000 at the National Advanced Driving Simulator. Have done a variety of research over my career, focused a lot on how do we keep people safe in the vehicle. And that's a big challenge. A lot of it historically is focused on what sort of vehicle technologies can we have that keep people safe. But more recently, it's focused on the topic of impaired driving. And so how do we deal with the fact that we still see this huge number of motor vehicle fatalities every year, despite all the advances in technology? And what can we learn about what the causes of that is? And more importantly, how can we develop a base of knowledge that helps us reduce that moving forward? So that's kind of my background in a nutshell. At the end of the day, my hope is that when my career is over, we'll have made some progress towards reducing the number of people that die every year on our roadways in Iowa and across the country.
Now, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on the show, because there's been a real big increase in fatal car accidents with people using marijuana. And we see a trend of a belief system that says, oh, marijuana is safe, you can do things on it. But the facts don't seem to correlate with that.
Yeah, it's a good point, Peter. And as we look at the data, we do see concerns in states where they have legalized cannabis that we see increasing fatalities that are associated with cannabis. One of the challenges, unfortunately, is that it's a hard problem to track. When we look at topics such as alcohol, everyone's kind of got an idea of that, 0.08 is illegal and anything under that is legal. When we talk about cannabis and driving, you don't wind up with the same metric. And unfortunately, even with alcohol, that metric isn't perfect. We know that there are people who have BACs that are below 0.08 that still wind up in motor vehicle crashes. Utah recently just changed their legal limit from 0.08 down to 0.05 and has seen some progress in reducing the number of fatalities that are associated with alcohol. But it's not an on-off switch. We know that when we engage in behaviors, and it can be a variety of behaviors, whether that's drinking alcohol, whether that's taking cannabis, whether it's taking a prescription medication, whether it's engaging in a distracting task, whether it's driving while drowsy. We know that those functionally increase our odds of being involved in a crash. And it's not you do this and you will be involved in a crash, or you do this and you'll be involved in a fatal crash. But it's really about increasing the odds that you're going to be involved in a crash. And anytime we do something that takes away from our capabilities to respond to an emergent event, we wind up putting ourselves and others at risk. Unfortunately, what we know is that when we design our nation's highways, they're designed to be somewhat forgiving. So we don't set speed limits at the maximum speed limit you can drive under perfect conditions. We set them at a speed limit that's based on understanding that the system's not perfect. Our vehicles are designed to be forgiving if we're involved in a crash to prevent us from being killed. And so there's not a one-to-one correlation between engaging in this behavior and being involved in a crash or being involved in a fatal crash. When we look at it, I've done some research on crash avoidance systems, and one of the struggles is that as you look at these crash situations, getting all the pieces to come together is a rare event. So over the course of your life, you think about it, how many times is the average person involved in a crash? And you kind of lump them all together. If you look at whether it's here in Iowa, it's the deer running into the roadway. I remember when my insurance company told me it would be good if I didn't get involved in another deer crash after I had 3 in 2 years. I'm like, well, I can't control the fact that deer run across the road I drive home from work on. But they said it would be good if you didn't do that. But I had 3 in 2 years, and I haven't had one in 15 years since then. And so there's a little bit of I don't want to call it bad luck involved in there, but it is at one level. You have to have the circumstances, right? To have all these things occur at the same time. You have to be driving by at the point where the deer's right across the road. Similarly, if we think about a vehicle-to-vehicle crash, I've got to do something that takes my attention off the roadway, such that I don't observe a change in the vehicle ahead, such that there's this potential for a crash. One of my colleagues, Tom Dingus at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, he was actually here at the University of Iowa as my master's advisor. But one of the things he talked about when we talked about distraction is that, very rarely do you see and by very rarely he meant almost never, do you see a crash when the driver's eyes are facing forward and attending to the roadway. When you're fully attentive, you're generally able to avoid crashes. And so that is our challenge today, is how do we avoid crashes moving forward? How can we prevent them, whether they're from distraction, drowsiness, or cannabis?
We're going to take a short break. We come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Brown and sort of flush out this cannabis driving relationship. Stay tuned. We'll see you all after the break. You don't want to miss this.
The black truck? Hey, Christina from accounting.
Yeah, hi.
Hey, I used to date a girl named Christina.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then she dumped me for my best friend. You want to see some photos of them that I took?
I don't.
I thought we talked about this, buddy.
Buzz and overshared again?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna call a car.
That's a smart idea.
So yeah, I know, that's why I did it.
Hey, you're gonna get back to the top of the mountain.
Does that mean I'm gonna get back with Christina?
No.
Oh.
No.
While a lot is changing in our world, at MediaCom, our focus remains the same, making sure you have the fastest, most reliable connection possible. During this critical time, we know your needs are changing. You may be working or learning from home, relying on telemedicine, or finding new ways to keep everyone entertained. If you need more speed, call or go online, and MediaCom will double your speed immediately for as low as $10 more a month for 1 year.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and we're talking about cannabis impaired driving and the fact that it may be much more dangerous than we think. And strangely enough, the risk is compounded by the fact that people generally think it's not risky. Dr. Brown, straight off, if we did a direct comparison between cannabis impairment and alcohol impairment, are they evenly balanced? Is cannabis just as dangerous as alcohol?
I think that's the $1 million question that everybody wants the answer to. And we've done some work here looking at both alcohol and at cannabis, looking at alcohol in combination with cannabis. And there's not a clean answer. I think one of the things that we know is that both of them, when we look at driving performance, degrade performance. And so if you've used cannabis and you're within a couple hours of use, and we put you in the driving simulator and we watch you drive, what we can see is you're more likely to be weaving around on the roadway, regardless whether it's cannabis or alcohol. The thing with alcohol is that drivers seem less aware of their impairment, and they're less able to try to accommodate that impairment. So when we put a person in the simulator with alcohol, they tend to drive faster, they tend to weave around in their lane more. When we take somebody that's used cannabis and we put them in the simulator and we look at how their driving performance changes, we see them also weaving more on the road, so less able to control the heading of their vehicle. But we see something a little bit different, which is they typically or oftentimes will drive a little bit slower than what they normally do. And so, this is a pattern similar to what we might see with somebody who's distracted, which is, okay, I know that I'm not quite 100%, so I'm going to slow down a little bit to give myself a little bit more time to respond. And so even though somebody might tell you that they are not impaired, they make adjustments to their driving that kind of provide some glimpse into their mind that they might be impaired. When we look at just kind of the outcomes, people who are driving under the influence of alcohol are more likely to leave their lane than what people who are using cannabis. And so that might be a strategy shift when we look at the data, which is, the alcohol impaired drivers are just kind of unable to know what's going on, whereas somebody who's using cannabis maybe is shifting their mindset, which is rather than trying to keep the vehicle straight in the lane, which requires more effort, maybe I'm just going to a model where I just want to keep the vehicle between the lane markers, which doesn't require quite as much effort and is a more attainable goal. As you said, when we look beyond the simulator research and we look out to what's going on the roadway, we do know that both seem to lead to some increases in fatalities. And again, this is harder to track. Alcohol, it's easy. If you've got alcohol level in your body when you're picked up and it says it's 0.09% BAC, you're legally intoxicated, and we can kind of tie that to the changes in performance. With cannabis, it doesn't have that same model of performance. And so, with cannabis, you absorb it into your body, and you very quickly, particularly if you're doing inhalation method, it goes up very high in your blood, and then it drops down very quickly, and then kind of levels out. But the problem is that the cannabis is actually entering into your brain, and so even though it's not showing up in your blood anymore, you still have impairment that's present in your brain. And so, getting the THC levels in your blood and saying we want to tie that to your impairment isn't as straightforward as with alcohol, where there's very strong correlation. And so that's one of the struggles we've got is trying to tie that back in from a research standpoint to understanding, when is somebody impaired when we don't have a biological measure that clearly says, okay, this person has had enough cannabis recently enough that they are impaired.
When I was a high school and college student back in the 60s and 70s, when we smoked marijuana, which was very weak in terms of THC content then as we have now, we were wary about driving. We knew we were impaired, just as if we were drinking. So obviously you sort of try to avoid driving, go to a place, be at someone's house. But driving's become so big in American culture, and the potency has gotten so much higher. Just to see marijuana in a dialogue equivocal to alcohol in terms of fatalities on highways, I think it's a great conversation for us, but I think the average person is a long way from thinking marijuana is dangerous to driving. What do you think we can do to make people more aware of this risk?
And Peter, you and I know back in the days when we were growing up, even on the alcohol side, there was a public acceptance to driving while drunk. And it's unfortunate, but Mothers Against Drunk Driving did a lot to change that. And it's now societally unacceptable. As you've indicated on the cannabis side, there is a perception that it is safe to drive. And I think one of the challenges there, and I can come at it from different ways, one of which is that people are being reckless, which I don't know if that is completely the case. But on the alcohol side, we've kind of developed a metric which says, after I've consumed alcohol, I need to wait so long to drive, or I can have one beer and then it's safe to drive home. And so people have these mental models of what is safe to do and how to manage the alcohol. On the cannabis side, we haven't been able to give people a good idea of how much cannabis can you have and still be safe to drive. And so people kind of are winging it on their own based on their own perceptions. And that's one of the things we have to figure out is how can we provide guidance to users so that they know when it's safe and when it's not safe. Can I have one puff off a joint and drive? Is too many? And that's one of the things we've still got to provide guidance to people so that they can make better choices.
This is really fascinating. And the level of risk is something we need to talk about. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to ask you to talk more about the research you do and what lies ahead in terms of marijuana and drug driving research and public safety. See you all after the break. You don't want to miss this.
Today, more than ever, you need fast, reliable internet. At Mediacom, we want you to know you can count on us. Our fiber-powered 100% gigabit technology network was built for the future. We have enormous capacity and power and 99.99% network reliability. So even though these are uncertain times, we're prepared. And you can be certain we'll keep your world connected.
Multiple studies have shown that marijuana can slow both driver reaction and response time, which can be really dangerous. He's here. He's here.
Wait. What?
I can't drive.
Why?
My. Oh.
Every second, 127 new devices connect to the internet. You can feel it happening, our digital world expanding with every breath. We're entering a whole new era of connectivity, and Mediacom will be ready to power it with one of the nation's first 10G platforms. We'll be bringing you more speed, more capacity, more security, and the power to do more than you ever dreamed possible.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're talking with Dr. Tim Brown from the National Advanced Driving Simulator at the University of Iowa and the groundbreaking research that's exposing the risks of marijuana use and drugged driving. Tim, this has a tremendous impact on a new and younger generation of drivers. What is some of the challenge and the things that you're learning about drug driving?
Very good question, Peter. And I think when we look at the younger drivers, there are particular concerns that we have. We've done some work looking at data from individuals who are not actually acutely using it. So people who are just driving and those that have, and comparing those people to people who have never used cannabis. And so when we look at that, we see a pronounced difference in the driving performance where we see people who are who have not used, who are driving worse than an age-matched group of individuals who are not cannabis users. And so that gives us some particular concern when we start looking at kind of brain development. So when we look at younger drivers and we look at the developing brain, which continues up until age 25 roughly, if you're using cannabis, what are the impacts it's having on brain structure? We know that the cannabinoid receptors in the brain are what is being activated, and that's what's causing these effects from cannabis use, whether they're the pleasurable effects or whether they're the impairment. And so what's going, the fundamental question is, how does use of cannabis change what's going on in your brain and that brain development? Because what we know, what we've seen is that there are observable differences between people who use cannabis and those who do not on normal tasks like driving. Obviously, there's a lot more research that needs to be done to better understand that, but we do know that just that occasional use can have impacts later in life in terms of how you operate a motor vehicle. And it does raise the question about what impacts does it have on other daily life activities.
Now, is this more dramatic when you're looking at marijuana impact on long-term driving ability versus alcohol?
That's a good question, and that's one of the research topics that we're working on with Yale. So they've actually got a grant application that we're partnering with them on to look at that very question, which is what happens over time when you look at alcohol use and brain development. We're just started a discussion with them on applying for a grant to look at that same question when it comes to cannabis use, looking at people in their early teens before they start driving and looking at how things change over time based on whether or not they use cannabis and how much they use cannabis. Very important questions that will hopefully get us better answers about what's going on from a brain development standpoint and how choices you make about whether or not you drink or smoke marijuana impact your cognitive capabilities later in life. And again, in our case, from a driving research standpoint, what does that impact on your likelihood of being ticketed, your likelihood of being involved in a crash, or unfortunately, you're likely to be involved in a fatal crash.
Now, we have looked at research on the show that showed that longer term marijuana users, even moderate users, by the time they reach ages in 50 to 60, there's a higher incidence at a younger age of strokes, heart disease, heart attacks. So we're seeing health effects, and we're also seeing much more research showing that the relationship between marijuana use and psychotic breaks and schizophrenia and other mental health things is now, this is all new research, because really this is a whole new thing that's happening, and the potency of marijuana is much greater. But let's take a quick turn back to this, that you have this sort of spaceship that you can put people in. It's like a real life driving situation. And so you actually take people and they actually use marijuana and they go in and you measure what they do. Has anybody ever gone into that setting, especially, somebody may say, oh yeah, I can handle this, I can do it. Has anybody ever done it and driven better impaired with marijuana or alcohol? I mean, I know it may not be a big probability, but has it ever happened?
Well, what I can tell you is, having consented a lot of the people who participate in our research, there is this constant idea that they can drive better under the influence of cannabis. And what we've seen is, across the board, there's a general decline in performance. And one of the challenges becomes, as you look at it, that similar to like drowsiness, it can come and go, which is maybe you can do better for a little while, but then you degrade, and then you do better for a little while and you degrade. And so there's a lot of individual variability, but when we put people in the simulator, we have them drive for half hour, 40 minutes. Over that period of time, what we do see is we see periods at a minimum where performance is degraded. And for some people, it's an across the board, they're driving worse than when they're not under the influence of cannabis. And so it winds up being a complex question, because it does depend upon what your usage patterns are and kind of what you develop from a strategy standpoint to accommodate this. Because as we talked about earlier, people will use cannabis and drive. And so one of the things is that they unfortunately develop strategies to kind of minimize the effects, but they're not always effective, and they can't be effective for a prolonged period of time.
Well, we're going to take a short break, but yeah, it seems like a risky business, because then if you add cannabis and a little bit of drinking at the same time, and then you're tired and you get behind the wheel, my God, it's like a perfect storm of bad things can happen. Let's take a break, and afterwards, I'd like you to share some final comments, insights, and advice for our audience. You all stay tuned. You don't want to miss this.
Devices connect to the internet. You can feel it happening. Our digital world expanding with every breath. We're entering a whole new era of connectivity, and MediaCom will be ready to power it with one of the nation's first 10G platforms. We'll be bringing you more speed, more capacity, more security, and the power to do more than you ever dreamed possible. Today, more than ever, you need fast, reliable internet. At MediaCom, we want you to know you can count on us. Our fiber-powered 100% gigabit technology network was built for the future. We have enormous capacity and power, and 99.99% network reliability. So even though these are uncertain times, we're prepared, and you can be certain we'll keep your world connected.
Whether it's advice on managing your anxiety or tools to help you stay grounded, Coping-19 provides a range of resources and self-care tips to help you cope with this pandemic. We can help. Find the resources that work best for you at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. Today on Surviving Bad, we're talking about drugged driving, specifically cannabis impaired driving, and what we've learned about the risks of marijuana use when you're behind the wheel of a car. It's a lot more dangerous than we may think. Let's see what advice our guest, Tim, has to share. Tim, the ball's in your court. I mean, you're both a parent and a researcher. What advice would you give to our viewers?
Good question. And I think the the challenge is that the world's a lot more complicated than it was a decade ago. 10 years ago, you could have said, don't use cannabis and drive. Today, there's a lot of states around the country where cannabis is legal either recreationally or medicinally. And it's kind of changed the conversation that people have, and it's changed people's perceptions. And so I think the key factor for me is what we want to do is we want to provide guidance that is based on what is safe. We don't want to punish people for doing things that is safe, but at the same time, we don't want people to engage in behavior that's likely to increase their risk of being in a crash or somebody else getting injured. And so I think in the state of the knowledge that we have, I think the general guidance has got to be, it's not safe at this point in time to drive within 2-3 hours of having used cannabis from a smoking standpoint or an inhalation standpoint. And if you're going to use an edible, it's probably 6 to 8 hours that you want to avoid it. Are those perfect answers? No, because there's still a lot of things we don't understand. But to start off with, I think that's a spot we can start with while we still get more answers. And I think that's what we have to have people understand, is that it is unsafe to drive after using cannabis. And you need, until we know more, be cautious and avoid using cannabis. As the signs say on the interstate when you're driving along, if you feel different, you drive different. And that is kind of the message to stick with, and avoid driving if you feel like you might be still experiencing the influence of cannabis.
Now, going back to being a parent with grown young children, what are the kind of things you talk about with them?
I think you tell them to be smart. And I think that's what you want is it's not just about cannabis. It's about everything. It's like, do you really need to make this trip when the roads are icy? And that is the struggle, even with young adults, is that they think they're invincible. And you have to have those conversations about making smart choices. And that it's a constant conversation that you need to have with your kids, and always remind them that, it's not necessarily something that you're going to do that's going to be the problem. It can be something somebody else does and you're just not able to respond in time. And so even if you're trying to be smart, you still need to make smart choices and keep yourself out of potential danger.
Tim, thank you so very much for joining us today and giving us a little bit of background on an emerging issue and some emerging risks that everybody needs to know more about. They can check out your website in the links after the show. Thank you all for joining us today. Check out our website at healthyiowa.org for more information, and keep your eye on MediaCom MC22 for our next episode of Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. I'm MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.